Tug, a little blue Renault Clio, written by Tamsin Bramwell for her dad. A series of short stories for children featuring the adventures of Tug, a little blue Renault Clio and his friends from the cul-de-sac. Tug's Big Dash. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. Tug was dozing happily outside in the sunshine one morning. The sky was blue and the sun's rays were warming him nicely. He purred his engine happily, thinking today was going to be a good day, a nice day to be lazy at home. When suddenly Dominic, his owner's son, appeared in a panic. Dominic's new car had run out of insurance, and this meant his car was not allowed to run. Tug jumped to action and ferried Dominic and his dad to town to get some money out of the bank and then on to the insurance selling place. In a little while Dom's own car was happy again and was able to go on its merry way, Tug and his owner went home to have a nice long drink and a sit in the garden. Tug's a naughty boy. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. Tug is a mischievous little fellow, and one early morning he decided that today he was not going to be at all helpful. When his owner tried to start his engine, Tug just sat on the drive and decided that he wanted to stay home today. Mr. Richards was not at all happy, as he very quickly realised that unless Tug moved soon he was going to be late for work. Tug just sat on the drive and stubbornly refusing to start his engine and make any effort towards taking Mr. Richards to town. Mr. Richards shouted at Tug and lifted up his bonnet to see if there was something wrong with him, and then shouted at Tug again when he couldn't find anything wrong. In the end, Mr. Richards gave up and had to take the bus to town, even though he doesn't like the bus very much. He was now going to be late for work. Mrs. Richards stayed home to ring Mr. Baz, the mechanic, and tell him that Tug was a naughty boy, and to see if Baz could come and sort Tug out. Tug felt a little bad then, as he had only wanted to stay home today because he didn't want Mr. Richards to be late for work, or Mrs. Richards to tell him off, or for Mr. Baz to come out and poke him to see if he was broken. Mr. Baz came out later that day, and Tug decided that perhaps he'd better make an effort now, in case he got into more trouble when Mr. Richards came home. So when Mr. Baz tried the engine, Tug summoned up all his energy and made the engine work. Mrs. Richards was able to collect Mr. Richards from town at home time, so he didn't have to come home on the bus again. The next morning Tug was feeling much more willing to go to town, and Mr. Richards did not have to catch the bus. Tug on Holiday, featuring Mr. Puff, the exhaust repairman. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. His owners have two sons, Jonathan and Dominic. Both own cars of their own. Jonathan has a Mazda. Dominic owns a Mini. Dominic does not live with Tug, as he has a house of his own, but he often visits as he doesn't live very far away. Tug sometimes goes on holiday with his owners, as their daughter lives a long way away in Nottinghamshire. Tug likes going to see Tamsin, as he gets to drive on the very big roads called motorways. He pretends for a little while that he's a long-distance lorry or a big car. One time when he went to see Tamsin, Tug got a cough, and he had to go and see Mr. Puff, the exhaust repairman, to be checked out. Tug had to have a new part, as his exhaust had got a big hole in it. Mr. Puff was a naughty man, and he thought he could make Mr. Richards pay for Tug to be mended without mending him properly. Mr. Richards thought all the work had been done properly, so he paid, and then he and Tug went home to Tamsin's house. In a few days, though, Tug was coughing again. But it was time to go home now, so he had to drive home to the seaside with his cough. When he got home, Mr. Richards took him to see Baz, who was nice and friendly and takes good care of Tug. Mr. Baz said that Mr. Puff was a naughty man and gave Tug some medicine and another new part. And after that, Tug didn't cough any more. So Tug now knows that some people are nice and some people are naughty, even if they appear to be nice and helpful. Now Tug is more careful about who he sees when he's feeling poorly, and he's told Tamsin's car Skoda not to see Mr. Puff any more either, as he doesn't want him to get sick. Tug, the Wedding Car, featuring the big rescue. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. Tug was nicely washed and standing in line with the other big cars. He felt very puffed up and important today, as he knows that today he is going to be a wedding car. Tug knows that wedding cars are normally big and black and very shiny, and they have ribbons, and they normally have important jobs to do, like taking the bridesmaids to church or the happy couple to the hotel after the wedding is all over. Tug wasn't sure what job he was going to get, but as he stood in the line with the other cars he was very excited. Mr. Richard's youngest son Dom was getting married today, and the weather was lovely. He made sure all the cars were washed and polished, and his other son Jonathan had bought ribbons for all the cars. Mr. Richard said it was important that all the cars had ribbons, even though all the cars were different. Jonathan and Dominic went to the church early in Jonathan's burgundy Mazda, while Dom's car stayed at home to wait for him and his new wife, so that they could go on holiday all together. Tamsin was there too. Her car had been to the big Tesco's earlier on to collect all the big glasses for the reception, as her Skoda had a very large bottom with plenty of room to carry things. Tug knew what jobs all the other cars were going to be given, so he was very curious to see what job was left for him. Finally, Tug saw Mr. and Mrs. Richards coming down the drive in their best clothes. He was going to take them to church. Tug smiled a big smile and skipped all the way to town as he carried his important passengers to the wedding. After the wedding was over and Dominic and Rachel had gone on honeymoon, Tug and his friends helped tidy up. All the leftovers, spare plates, and all of those glasses were loaded into Tug, Skoda and Mazda to be taken home again. They lined up at the back door of the church waiting to be given something to carry. Eventually Skoda and Mazda were so full that they were dispatched home, while Tug was waiting for Mr. and Mrs. Richards to say goodbye and thank you to all the guests and Rachel's parents. Tug was very tired and his eyes were beginning to close. He had had a very busy day, but he was very keen to go home for a sleep. Tug tried to stay awake, but Mr. and Mrs. Richards were ever such a long time, and eventually he fell asleep, and his engine stopped running and his lights went out. Mr. and Mrs. Richards finally came. They found Tug fast asleep by the pavement. They were shocked but not really surprised, as they were quite tired too. Mr. Richards called Jonathan on the special phone he keeps in his pocket and asked him to bring Mazda back to town to help make Tug go. So Jonathan and Tamsin's husband Nick got in Mazda and whizzed to town to rescue Tug. When they got there, Tug was still asleep and had to be towed home with a big rope. When they were all at home again and all the cars gone to bed, all the people had a cup of tea. It was a very special day, and Tug was very proud that he'd been a wedding car, even if he was now very tired and had to be rescued.
Tug passes the test. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. Tug was very nervous. Mr. Richards had told him that today he must take an exam and he must pass, or he would have to go and stay at the garage for a while until he could pass the test. Tug doesn't like tests, as he is a simple fellow and finds the stress of remembering what he has to do a bit much. Mr. Richards told him that it would be all right really, and that he would take him to the test place and collect him again later once he had taken his exam. Tamsin was staying with Mr. and Mrs. Richards for some holiday at the time, so once Tug had been dropped off at the test place, Tamsin's Skoda took Mr. and Mrs. Richards round to Grandma's house for a cup of tea. Mr. Richards didn't tell Tug that he was worried about the exam too. Mr. Richards was worried that Tug might be expensive to fix this time, as Tug had had some occasions of being mischievous in the mornings and not starting when he should. After a while, Mr. Richards thought it was safe for them to go to the garage and see how Tug was getting on with his exam. Scode waited nervously in the car park to find out whether Tug had passed. Mr. Richards came running very, very fast out of the garage, and Tamsin was worried that he was angry because Tug was going to be expensive to fix. But Mr. Richards ran straight past Scode to where Tug was waiting hopefully and gave him a big pat on the bonnet. He had passed the test. Tug was very pleased that he didn't have to stay at the He didn't have to stay at the garage, as it is an odd place, and he doesn't like it very much. He loves Mr. and Mrs. Richards very much, and doesn't like to be away from them for very long. Mr. Richards drove Tug home, and Mrs. Richards and Tamsin came along in Skoda. That day was a very happy day indeed. Tug the ambulance. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards, and he lives by the seaside. It was dark. Tug was fast asleep in his usual position on the drive. Suddenly he was wide awake. Mr. Richards was coming down the drive, putting his coat on as he went. This is very odd, thought Tug, who wasn't accustomed to getting up in the middle of the night. What is going on for Mr. Richards to want to go somewhere in the middle of the night? Right then, Tug, Mr. Richards said quietly. Grandma's house on the double. Oh dear, thought Tug, this can't be good. Mr. Richards had received a telephone call to say that his mum had fallen out of bed and he had to go to her house very quickly to get her back in bed. Tug liked Mr. Richards' mum. He called her Grandma the same as Mr. Richards' children did, and she used to give him 3 biscuits with his cup of tea. Tug hoped that Grandma would be all right, as he thought it must be very frightening to fall out of bed. Tug doesn't know what it is like to fall out of bed, because he sleeps on the drive, but it is a big slope, so he figures it is like falling down the drive whilst you are still asleep. They raced to Grandma's house, and Mr. Richards disappeared into the house, leaving Tug to worry by himself out on the road. He didn't have to wait long, as suddenly an ambulance appeared with all its lights flashing. And the driver disappeared into Grandma's house too. Oh dear, thought Tug, this really can't be very good. Poor Grandma. Before much longer, Mr. Richards, the ambulance man, and Grandma all appeared. Grandma got to ride in the ambulance, and Mr. Richards told Tug that he had to drive very fast behind the ambulance, as they had to get Grandma to hospital very quickly. Tug knew that it was important, but it was also very exciting to drive so fast to keep up with the ambulance. Grandma had to stay in hospital for a while, until the doctors thought she was not poorly anymore. But Tug took Mr. Richards every day to the hospital so that he could see Grandma. Tug thought he went so often that perhaps he ought to know the way by himself. But he doesn't go anywhere unless someone goes with him, as he is often afraid he might not find his way home again. Tug the Taxi, featuring Jack the Chipman. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio who belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards, and he lives by the seaside. Tug likes food. He especially likes chips. Sometimes, on a Friday, he takes Mr. Richards and Grandma to the seaside for chips. He drives to Grandma's house and she gets in. He's always very careful when Grandma gets in, as she is very old, and he is frightened that she might fall out of the door or something when she gets in. Mr. Richards leans Grandma up against Tug while he opens the door and locks Grandma's gate. Then he helps Grandma get in. Tug always holds his breath until Grandma is safely in the car, as she is so unsteady it makes him nervous. Anyway, once they're all in safely, they drive to a chip shop called Cousin Jack's. That sounds good. Where a nice man called Jack gives Mr. Richard some chips and a piece of fish or two. Then they are off to the seaside, so that they can eat their chips whilst watching the waves crashing onto the shore. Tug doesn't care for fish, but he is rather fond of chips. Grandma often tries to give her chips to Tug, as she doesn't want to eat all her portion. Mr. Richard sees Grandma doing this, but doesn't really mind, as Tug is his favourite car. And he knows that really Tug does a lot of things, despite being a very small car. Not that long ago, Tug had extra passions for his Friday visit to Jack. Mr. Richard's daughter and her husband, Nick, came to stay for a few days, and they wanted some chips too. So they all went to collect Grandma and the chips, and then they all sat on the hill and watched the waves while they ate their chips. Tug was disappointed because Grandma kept giving her spare chips to Tamsin rather than to him. Poor Tug. But he was feeling a little heavy because of all the extra passengers anyway, so he didn't think there would be any room for extra chips. After they had finished all their chips, Tug drove down into the village where Tamsin bought ice creams in the little shop. After that, they were all so stuffed that they thought they had better go home now, so that they don't eat any more things.
Tug is sad and gets to be a roadie. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards, and he lives by the seaside. Tug knew that today was an odd day from the moment he woke up. Things were going on very early that morning. Extra people had been arriving in the last few days, and there were more cars than usual in the cul-de-sac. Everyone looked very sad, and when Tug asked Mazda why all the owners were sad, Mazda told him that it was because Grandma had gone to live in heaven, and that they wouldn't be going to Grandma's house for cups of tea any more. Tug was very upset at this news because he likes Grandma's house for tea. She lets him have 3 biscuits, and sometimes he gets to take her to seaside for the chips. Tug and Mazda were going to be part of the cortege, which is a fancy word for a line of cars that follows behind the special car called a hearse. When an owner goes to heaven, other owners have a special service called a funeral, and you get to take the original owner to the service too. They get to travel in the hearse, and all the other owners travel in a long line behind the hearse. The cortege goes very slowly through the town or village that the owner used to live in, so that everyone else in the village knows that they are leaving. Tug wasn't sure whether he wanted to be the first car behind the hearse, in case Grandma jumped out of the hearse at him. Mr. Richards said it would be all right, and gave him a special black flag to go in the window, so that other cars on the road would know he was part of the special line. Tug took his place behind the hearse, and when all the other owners were ready in their cars, off they went to the service. They drove very slowly. Some people came and stood on the pavement to watch Tug and his friends drive by. Tug thought about waving, but then thought that probably wasn't a good idea, in case his flag blew away. The service was a long way from Grandma's house, and it seemed to take ages to get there as the hearse and the cortege drove very slowly. Finally they were there, and all the other owners went inside for the funeral service, and Tug and his friends stayed outside with the special hearse. The hearse explained what a service was like. There would be some singing, although no one really felt like singing because they were all so sad. And then a man would say some nice things about Grandma to the people, in case they didn't know the nice things. Then Grandma would be shipped off to heaven in a wooden box behind some curtains, while a man played the organ. Then everyone would come out and go to a special lunch. The hearse didn't know everything, though. Mazda told him that Jonathan, his owner, was going to sing a special song to his grandma because he was carrying Jonathan's guitar that morning. When all the people came out, they all stood around talking and crying and hugging each other for what seemed like ages, and then Tug was asked to do something very special. Could he carry Jonathan's guitar home because Mazda now got extra passengers and wouldn't have room for it? Mazda explained that normally people who help musicians are called roadies. They are big and strong and carry lots of things when a band goes on tour. Tug was very proud and thinks he would make a very good roadie, even though he is very small.
Tug the Removals Van featuring Tom the Trailer. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. Tug is a very special little car and gets to do lots of things that really only big cars should do. Today he is going to Uncle Tony's house to collect his friend Tom for a playdate. Tom is a trailer that belongs to Uncle Tony, but sometimes Mr. Richards needs to borrow the trailer for moving things about, so Tug gets to meet his friend for a playdate. Tug has to wear a special harness with lights on it before Mr. Richards and Uncle Tony can attach the trailer to Tug's towing hook. Tug wears the harness so that the other cars following him can see when he puts the brakes on. It seems to take ages to get Tom connected to the harness towing hook because Mr. Richards makes Tug test all the lights, but finally they are ready to go. After Grandma went to heaven, Tug was helping Mr. Richards clear some things out of Grandma's house. They loaded lots of pieces of the old wood and bits of scrap metal in the trailer, and then off they went to the scrap yard. It was very scary for Tug because when he got to the scrapyard there were piles and piles of old things. Most of the piles were bigger than him. Out of the corner of one eye, Tug spotted some other cars laying on top of one another. Tug spotted them being squished by a big machine. His eyes opened very wide with horror as he thought for a minute that perhaps now he was here at the scrapyard, but he squished himself. Now then, Tug, Mr. Richards said, don't you worry about those cars. You are here to drop all this wooden stuff, not to stay here and be squished. Tug felt a little better, but he felt very uneasy when Mr. Richards drove him and Tom to a big weighing machine. They drove onto a platform where all the wooden bits and stuff to be weighed. Then they all got off. Mr. Richards and Nick took all the wooden bits and scrap metal out of Tom and put them in big, giant bins. Then Tug was very surprised to find that he had to go back and stand on the weighing platform again. Mr. Richards said that this was to find out how much all the scrap stuff was worth, but Tug didn't understand. He was just glad that he was going home now and didn't have to live at the scrapyard like the squished cars. Tug subs in and pretends to be John's car. Tug is a little blue Renault Clio. He belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Richards and he lives by the seaside. Tug's friend Mazda was feeling very tired. He had done too many miles and needed a break. Mazda belonged to Jonathan, the son of Tug's owner, Mr. Richards. Jonathan was due to make a trip to Nottinghamshire to see Tamsin, Mr. Richards' daughter, who lives far away from the seaside. Mr. Richards had a bright idea that because Mazda was tired, Tug could take Jonathan instead. In return, Mazda would do all of Tug's normal jobs until Tug got home again. Master thought this was a great idea, as he really didn't feel up to driving all the way to Nottinghamshire to see Tamsin, but he thought he could manage to take Mr. Richards to work and back, which wasn't very far at all. Tug was very excited to be going to Nottinghamshire with Jonathan, as he likes to drive on the motorway. There are no motorways near the seaside, so it is very thrilling for Tug to have a chance to drive on one. Jonathan takes good care of Tug and puts all sorts of different music in his CD player for the journey. When they arrive at the other end, Tug gets to spend some time with Skoda, whilst Jonathan spends some time with his sister. Tug is very keen to get home and swap places with Master, as it is fun to be in another car for a little while, but he likes being with Mr. and Mrs. Richards' personal chariot. Tug, boat, ambulance, roadie, removals van, taxi and wedding car. As he goes to sleep that night on the drive, he thinks to himself that it's not really a bad life being a little car, especially a little car with a big heart.